The roar of the luxury car's engine echoed through the empty street as it pulled up to a stop. The sleek black sedan gleamed under the late afternoon sun, its tinted windows reflecting the surrounding high-rise buildings. Inside, Ethan Blackwood, one of the most ruthless billionaires in the world, sat behind the wheel, his expression as cold as the city he dominated that he wasn't used to stopping. Every minute of his life was calculated, planned, and executed with military precision. But today, something strange tugged at his gut. It was an unsettling feeling, like the pull of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. As he stepped out of the car, his polished shoes clicked on the concrete, the sharp sound piercing the air. But what caught his attention wasn't the bustling city around him or the luxury shops lining the streets. It was a child. The boy, no older than 10, sat on the sidewalk, legs crossed and surrounded by a pile of colorful chalks. He was focused, drawing something on the pavement with intense concentration, unaware of the world around him. The image the boy was sketching was abstract, a swirling mess of shapes and lines. But there was something mesmerizing about his movements. Ethan paused. His gaze locked onto the child's face. Something about it seemed eerily familiar. The boy's sharp features, the way his eyes narrowed in concentration. It reminded him of someone he hadn't thought about in years. Without thinking, Ethan stepped closer, his heartbeat suddenly quickening for reasons he couldn't explain. The child looked up, his big brown eyes meeting Ethan's with an unexpected intensity. There was a moment of silence before the boy's lips curled into a shy smile, though it was the sadness behind it that struck Ethan the most. Curiosity got the better of him. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. He bent down and extended it to the boy. "Here," he said, his voice gruff, not bothering with pleasantries. "Take it." The boy's eyes flickered to the money, then back up to Ethan, his expression unreadable. He hesitated, then reached out with trembling hands and took the bills. But as his fingers brushed Ethan's, something in his eyes shifted. It was like a flicker of recognition, but it was gone too fast for Ethan to grasp. Before he could say another word, the boy turned back to his drawing, seemingly uninterested in the transaction. But as Ethan started to walk away, something caught his eye. The child's locket. It hung around his neck, the delicate gold chain resting against the boy's chest. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he caught a glimpse of what was inside. A faded photo of a woman he hadn't seen in over a decade. It was Caroline, his ex-lover. The woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace after their painful breakup. He'd searched for her in vain, convinced she had left him for another man. But now, as his gaze lingered on the locket, a sinking feeling washed over him. Could it be? The boy's features, his sharp jawline, the dark eyes, were unmistakable. He didn't need to know more. This child, could he be his? Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The locket, Caroline, the child. The world seemed to blur around him as he tried to process what he had just seen. For years, he had buried his memories of Caroline, burying the pain of their breakup deep inside. It wasn't just the loss of the woman he loved that had haunted him. It was the way she had vanished from his life. No explanación, no closure, just an empty space where a future had once been. And now this boy, this homeless child with his locket. Ethan's pulse quickened. Was it possible? Was this child his son? His thoughts spiraled, but before he could make sense of it all, he shook himself out of his stupor. The boy was still there, sitting on the cold pavement, completely unaware of the storm raging in Ethan's mind. He couldn't leave it like this. He couldn't just walk away. With a steadying breath, Ethan turned and approached the boy again, this time with more purpose. The child barely looked up as he neared, still absorbed in his chalk drawing. "Hey kid," Ethan said, his voice rougher than he intended. The boy looked up again, their eyes locking for a fleeting moment. "I don't suppose you know a woman named Caroline?" Ethan asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The boy's expression shifted ever so slightly. His eyes, wide and wary, searched Ethan's face for a moment before he responded in a soft voice. "She's my mom." Ethan's heart stopped. The boy's words hung in the air, heavy and laden with something he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. His stomach tightened. Caroline was his mother? Had she kept this child from him all these years? Where is she? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His breath caught in his throat, the question spilling out before he could filter it. The boy's expression darkened. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. She's gone, he said softly, looking down at his lap. I don't know where she is anymore. Ethan's chest tightened. The words hit him like a blow. Gone. Caroline was gone again. But why? And why had she never told him about this child? Where are your parents? Ethan asked, the concern in his voice now raw. Do you have somewhere to go? The boy shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting away. I don't, he muttered, then quickly added, I'm fine. But it was clear that he wasn't fine. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt, and the darkness in his eyes spoke volumes about the kind of life he'd already lived at such a young age. Ethan's mind was spinning, but there was something else, something nagging at him. There was an inexplicable pull to this boy, an undeniable connection that went beyond mere coincidence. Let me take you somewhere, Ethan said suddenly, before his mind could second-guess his decision. I can help you. The boy glanced up at him with skepticism. Why would you want to help me? His voice was small but defiant that Ethan's jaw clenched. This wasn't the time for explanations, not with a child who had clearly seen the darker side of life. But there was no backing down now. He had to know the truth. Because I think I know you, Ethan replied, his voice firm, though his hands trembled slightly. And I need answers. The boy looked at him, uncertainty clouding his expression. For a moment, Ethan thought he would reject the offer, but then the child slowly stood up. He hesitated, glancing at the locket once more before giving a small nod. Okay, the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper as they began to walk down the street, side by side. Ethan's mind raced. Every step felt heavy with the weight of what he had just discovered and the uncertainty of what was still to come. What had Caroline been hiding? Why had she kept this child from him? And, most importantly, what was the connection between them that no one had ever spoken of? All of those questions lingered as they walked further into the unknown, toward a future that Ethan wasn't prepared to face, but one that was now inescapable. Ethan and the boy walked in silence for a while, their footsteps echoing against the walls of the quiet street. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a web of mystery, one that he had unknowingly set in motion years ago, and now it was unraveling right before his eyes. They reached the edge of the city, where the towering skyscrapers gave way to quieter neighborhoods and abandoned buildings. The boy led the way with surprising confidence, his small frame surprisingly agile as he navigated the alleys and side streets. Ethan followed, his thoughts swirling. What's your name? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Liam, the boy replied without turning around. Liam, Ethan repeated, the name feeling strange on his tongue. How old are you? 10, Liam answered, his voice flat. Ethan nodded, his mind still reeling. This boy, his son, possibly, had lived a life that Ethan couldn't even begin to imagine. He had no idea where Liam had come from, or how Caroline had ended up keeping him a secret all these years. But there was no turning back now. Ethan was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. They finally arrived at a small, dilapidated apartment building tucked away in a corner of the neighborhood. The entrance was barely visible, hidden behind a stack of old crates and cardboard boxes. Liam led Ethan up a narrow staircase to the second floor, and they stopped in front of an apartment door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Liam knocked softly, then waited. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked vaguely familiar. She was older now, but the resemblance to Caroline was unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was her, but something had changed. This woman was no longer the vibrant, carefree lover he had once known. The lines on her face told the story of hardship, of years of struggle. She blinked at him, confused. Who are you? I'm Ethan, he said, his voice coming out more softly than he expected. Ethan Blackwood. Her eyes widened, recognition dawning on her face. But instead of the warmth that once existed between them, there was only a flash of something else, fear. What are you doing here? She asked quickly, her voice trembling. I've been looking for you, Ethan replied, his voice tinged with urgency. For years. She looked over at Liam, her expression tightening. You shouldn't have brought him here. Liam's hand found the locket again, his fingers fiddling with it nervously. Ethan noticed the motion, but his gaze remained fixed on Caroline. Why didn't you tell me about him? Ethan's voice was sharp now, the years of unanswered questions flooding to the surface. Why did you keep him from me? Caroline looked away, her eyes glossing over with emotion. I had to, she whispered. I didn't want him to be like you. Ethan's heart clenched. Like me, he echoed, confused. She took a step back, her hands trembling as she leaned against the doorframe. Ethan, I didn't want him to grow up in your world. The world of power, money, ruthlessness. I didn't want him to become like you. There was the accusation, the belief that Ethan had been too cold, too distant, too focused on his empire to ever be a father. But it was more than just that. Caroline had kept Liam hidden away from him, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she was letting on. Liam, sensing the tension, stepped forward. He lifted his chin and met Ethan's gaze with the same intense stare that had captivated him on the street. Why didn't you come for me? He asked, his voice soft but piercing. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had no answer. The years had slipped by too quickly, and he hadn't even known this child existed. He had been too absorbed in his own world, too focused on building his empire, to see what was right in front of him. I didn't know, Ethan finally said, his voice cracking. I didn't know. Caroline's face softened for a moment, but it quickly hardened again. You think it's that simple? Ethan, there's more at play here than you realize. Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. What was she talking about? What more could there be? Before he could ask, Caroline turned and motioned for them to come inside. We need to talk. Ethan stepped into the small apartment, and for the first time, he noticed the faint smell of stale air and old books. It was far from the life he had imagined for his son, far from the world he would have wanted for him. But what had happened to Caroline? What had driven her to this point? And why had she kept Liam from him all these years? As Caroline closed the door behind them, Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a lost child. This was about something deeper. And whatever it was about to change everything. The moment Caroline closed the door, an eerie silence settled over the room. The small apartment was sparsely furnished, an old couch with frayed edges, a tiny wooden table, and a single chair pushed against the wall. The dim lighting cast long shadows, adding to the weight of the conversation about to unfold. Ethan remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. He had spent years believing Caroline had left him without reason, that she had simply walked away. But now, standing here, seeing the way she hesitated, the way her hands trembled as she reached for the locket around Liam's neck, he knew there was more to the story than he had ever imagined. Caroline took a deep breath, then looked at Liam. Sweetheart, why don't you go wash up? I need to talk to Mr. Blackwood alone. Liam's gaze flickered between them before he nodded and disappeared into the small bathroom. As soon as the door clicked shut, Ethan stepped closer. Start talking, Caroline. She exhaled sharply. You don't get to demand answers like that, Ethan. His jaw tightened. I think I do. I just found out I have a son. Caroline flinched at his words, but she quickly masked her reaction. She leaned against the kitchen counter, her arms crossed tightly. I never wanted you to find out. Ethan's heart pounded. Why? Caroline hesitated. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if she was struggling to find the right words. Finally, she whispered, because I was protecting him. Ethan's breath hitched. Protecting him? From what? From me? Caroline's eyes shimmered with something he couldn't quite place. Pain, regret, and fear all rolled into one. No, she said softly. From your family. Ethan's body went rigid. His family. Those two words sent a ripple of unease through him. He had grown up in a world of ruthless businessmen, power-hungry executives, and a father who believed emotions were a weakness. He had spent his entire life proving that he could be stronger than them, that he could build his empire without being consumed by the same greed and cruelty that had defined his upbringing. But Caroline's words stirred something dark inside him. My father? Ethan asked slowly, his voice dangerously low. Caroline nodded. Your father found out I was pregnant, and he gave me a choice. Ethan's stomach twisted. He could already imagine the ultimatum his father had delivered, could already hear the cold, calculating voice of the man who had raised him. What did he say? Ethan pressed at Caroline's hands curled into fists. He told me to disappear, that if I stayed, if I tried to be part of your life, he would destroy me and our child. He made it very clear that he had the power to make me vanish. Ethan's blood ran cold. His father had done this, he had ripped his family apart before it even had a chance to exist. For years, Ethan had believed Caroline had abandoned him, that she had simply moved on, but the truth was far more sinister. She had been forced to leave, forced to raise their son alone, living in fear that one wrong step would bring his father's wrath upon them. Ethan turned away, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing. His father had always been a ruthless man, but this was unforgivable. I had no choice, Ethan, Caroline continued, her voice breaking. I had to leave. I had to keep him safe. Ethan turned back to her, his chest heaving with restrained fury. And now? Are you still running? Caroline hesitated before shaking her head. No, your father is dead. Ethan's breath caught. He hadn't spoken to his father in years, not since he had taken full control of the company. But he had always assumed the old man would die comfortably in his mansion, surrounded by wealth and power. How, he asked. Caroline swallowed hard. A heart attack. 3 months ago. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind spinning. His father was gone. The man who had torn his world apart had finally lost the one thing he had spent his life clinging to, controlled that a heavy silence stretched between them. Finally, Caroline whispered, "That's why I came back. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could stop hiding." Ethan's gaze shifted toward the bathroom door, where Liam was still inside. His son, that a boy who had spent his entire life without knowing his father, all because of a man who had played God with their lives. Ethan clenched his fists. "You should have told me." Caroline let out a bitter laugh. "Would it have changed anything? Would you have fought for us, Ethan?" Ethan wanted to say yes. He wanted to swear that he would have done everything in his power to protect them. But the truth was, back then, he had been just as cold and ambitious as his father had wanted him to be. Would he have fought? Or would he have let Caroline go, thinking it was for the best? He didn't know. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't that man anymore. "I'm not my father, Caroline," Ethan said quietly. "I'm not going to walk away from him." Caroline's expression softened, but there was still doubt in her eyes. "And what happens now?" Ethan's gaze darkened with determination. "Now, I do what I should have done years ago." Caroline tilted her head. "Which is?" Ethan's voice was firm. "I take care of my son." At that moment, the bathroom door creaked open, and Liam stepped out, his curious eyes flickering between them. Ethan met his gaze and took a deep breath. "Liam," he said carefully, kneeling down to meet the boy at eye level. "How would you feel about coming home with me?" Liam's small fingers tightened around his locket. "You mean like a real home?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, a real home. No more living on the streets. No more struggling. You deserve better." Liam hesitated. He looked at his mother, then back at Ethan. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice small but full of hope. Ethan smiled for the first time that night. More than anything, Caroline wiped at the corner of her eye, nodding ever so slightly. "If that's what you want, Liam." Liam took a shaky breath. Then finally he whispered, "Okay." Ethan's heart clenched as he pulled Liam into a firm, protective embrace that had taken 10 years. But he wasn't going to waste another second. His father had stolen enough time from them. Now, Ethan was going to give his son the life he deserved. And nothing was going to stand in his way. The next morning, Ethan Blackwood stood in his penthouse apartment, gazing out at the sprawling city skyline. The view from his floor-to-ceiling windows had always been a symbol of his success. Power, wealth, and absolute control. But today, for the first time, it all felt hollow. Behind him, Liam sat at the massive marble dining table, his eyes darting around the luxurious apartment, unsure of how to exist in this new world. Caroline sat beside him, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee, her expression unreadable. Ethan turned and walked toward them, setting down a small box in front of Liam. The boy looked up at him hesitantly. "What's this?" Liam asked. Ethan gave him a small smile. "Something for you." Liam cautiously lifted the lid, and his eyes widened as he pulled out a brand new sketchbook and a set of high-quality colored pencils. "I noticed you like to draw," Ethan said. "I figured you could use something better than chalk and sidewalks." Liam's fingers traced over the smooth pages, his lips parting slightly in awe. Then, for the first time since they had met, a genuine smile stretched across his face. "This is really nice." Ethan's chest tightened. It was such a simple gesture, but the way Liam looked at him, as if he wasn't sure he deserved something so nice, made Ethan realize just how much this boy had gone without. Caroline cleared her throat. "That was thoughtful of you." Ethan met her gaze. "I meant what I said. I want to take care of him." She nodded but didn't say anything. The walls she had built around herself were still there, and Ethan knew it would take time to break through them. But just as the moment started to settle into something warm, something almost normal, Ethan's phone buzzed. He pulled it out and frowned at the name flashing on the screen. Jonathan Hale, his father's former right-hand man. Ethan sighed and stood, walking a few steps away before answering. "What is it, Hale?" There was a pause before the older man spoke, his tone sharp. "We need to talk. Now." Ethan glanced at Liam and Caroline before stepping toward the window, lowering his voice. "I'm Busse." "This isn't a request, Ethan. It's about your father's will." Ethan stiffened. "His will?" "Yes," Hale said. "And let's just say you're not going to like what's in it." Ethan's jaw clenched. He had assumed that with his father dead, the worst was over, that he could finally move on, rebuild the life that had been stolen from him. But if there was one thing he knew about his father, it was that even in death, the old man still had a way of pulling the strings. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes flickering toward Liam. For the first time in years, he had something to lose, and he had a feeling his father knew it. Ethan tightened his grip on the phone. "Where are you?" "Blackwood Tower." "The conference room." "Get here now." Jonathan Hale never used that tone unless something was serious. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before turning to Caroline and Liam. "I have to go take care of something. It's urgent." Caroline frowned. "Is everything okay?" Ethan forced a smirk, though his gut told him otherwise. "Just some business matters." He turned to Liam. "I'll be back soon, all right?" Liam nodded, still clutching the sketchbook. With that, Ethan grabbed his coat and strode out the door. Half an hour later, Ethan stepped into the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Blackwood Tower, the heart of his empire. Jonathan Hale sat at the head of the table, his expression grim, a stack of documents in front of him. Ethan didn't bother sitting. "Talk." Hale slid a file across the table. "Your father's final will." Ethan's stomach coiled with unease. He'd spent his whole life under Victor Blackwood's shadow, fighting to prove he wasn't just a pawn in his father's games. And yet, even in death, the old man had found a way to make his presence known. Flipping open the folder, Ethan's eyes scanned the legal jargon, until one sentence made his breath hitch. "The primary heir to the Blackwood fortune shall be contingent upon the recognition and acceptance of my illegitimate grandson, Liam Holloway." Ethan's pulse pounded. What the hell is this? Hale folded his hands together. "Your father knew about the boy, Ethan. He put a clause in the will stating that unless you formally acknowledge Liam as your son and integrate him into the Blackwood legacy, you will forfeit your entire inheritance." Ethan let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "He wants me to prove I'm fit to run my own empire by taking responsibility for a child I just met? Seems like it." Hale leaned back. "And if you refuse, everything, including this company, goes to the Blackwood Foundation's Board of Trustees. You'd lose control overnight." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. His father had never cared about him, had spent years manipulating him, but now, suddenly, he wanted to dictate his life from beyond the grave. Hale's voice dropped. "You and I both know the board has been circling like vultures, waiting for an opportunity to strip you of power. If you don't comply, they'll take everything." Ethan exhaled slowly. The Blackwood legacy meant nothing to him. He had built his success on his own. But if he walked away now, the same people who had sided with his father would take control, and that was something he wouldn't allow. His mind raced. If Liam was truly his son, no, that wasn't possible. Caroline would have told him that, wouldn't she? Ethan slammed the folder shut and stood. I need to confirm this. Hale nodded. I figured. I took the liberty of arranging a paternity test. The results will be expedited. Ethan's jaw clenched. He hated being controlled, but if this was his father's final move, he would play the game on his terms. Because if Liam was truly his, then Ethan Blackwood had far more to lose than just his empire. Ethan stormed into his penthouse, his pulse hammering. Caroline and Liam were sitting together on the couch, Liam doodling in his sketchbook while Caroline watched over him. She looked up the moment he entered, her face tensing at the sight of his expression. Ethan? He ignored the softness in her voice and walked straight to her, his jaw set. Tell me the truth, Caroline. Is Liam my son? Caroline stiffened. A flicker of something, guilt, fear, regret, flashed in her eyes before she quickly masked it. Why are you asking me that? Ethan exhaled sharply. Because my father knew about him. Because he put a damn clause in his will that forces me to acknowledge Liam as my son or lose everything. Her lips parted in shock. What? Ethan clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. I need to hear it from you. Did you keep my son from me? Caroline opened her mouth, but no words came. Her gaze dropped to Liam, who was still drawing, oblivious to the storm brewing between them. Finally, she swallowed hard and whispered, yes. Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped from under him. The truth hit him harder than he ever could have imagined. He took a step back, trying to breathe. Why? His voice was low, strained. Why didn't you tell me? Caroline's eyes filled with emotion. Because you weren't the same man back then, Ethan. You were ruthless, consumed by proving yourself to your father. You didn't care about anything but winning. She hesitated, then added softly, I was scared you'd see Liam as just another battle to win. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. I had a right to know. I know, she admitted, her voice breaking. And I regret it every day. But I didn't want Liam growing up as a pawn in your father's games. Ethan turned away, his chest heaving. He didn't know whether to be furious or devastated. He had a son, a child who had spent years living on the streets, struggling while he had lived in luxury. Unaware, Liam suddenly looked up, sensing the tension. Mom! His small voice cut through the silence. Is everything okay? Caroline wiped her eyes quickly and forced a smile. Everything's fine, sweetheart. But Ethan knew everything was far from fine, that he needed time to think. He needed to process this, that he needed to decide what kind of father he was going to be. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the sealed envelope on his desk. The paternity test results had arrived faster than expected. Hale had pulled some strings to expedite the process. His fingers hovered over the envelope. He already knew the truth, but seeing it in writing would make it real. No more doubts. No more what-ifs. Taking a sharp breath, he tore it open. 99.9% match. Ethan exhaled slowly, his pulse steadying even as his world shifted beneath him. Liam was his son, his flesh and blood. Memories of his own childhood flooded his mind. His father's cold expectations, the never-ending pressure to be perfect, the loneliness of growing up in an empire where love was just another business transaction. He couldn't let Liam go through that. But what kind of father could he be? A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Jonathan Hale stepped in, his expression unreadable. You saw the results? Ethan nodded. It's official. Hale folded his arms. Then you need to decide your next move. The board already caught wind of this. Some of them are questioning whether you're fit to lead Blackwood Enterprises now that you have. Personal distractions. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. Of course they are. Cameron Shaw is leading the charge. Ethan's eyes darkened at the name. Cameron Shaw had been circling his position for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. If Ethan showed any weakness, Shaw would take everything. Hale slid another file onto the desk. There's a board meeting tomorrow. If you don't have a solid response, they'll vote to push you out. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to let Shaw or anyone else dictate his fate. He stood, slipping the test results into his jacket pocket. Cancel all my meetings for today. Hale raised an eyebrow. Where are you going? Ethan met his gaze. To see my son. Ethan's sleek black car pulled up in front of the modest apartment where Caroline and Liam were staying. He had spent his life making ruthless decisions, buying out competitors, crushing those who stood in his way. But tonight, facing his son and the woman who had kept him a secret was the hardest thing he had ever done. He knocked once. Caroline opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. "Ethan, I need to talk to you. Both of you." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at Liam, who was sitting on the floor, sketching. Then, with a nod, she stepped aside. Ethan walked in and crouched in front of Liam, who looked up with those same sharp blue eyes. His eyes. "Hey, kid." Liam smiled shyly. Ethan took a steadying breath. "There's something I need to tell you." He pulled the folded paper from his jacket and placed it on the table. "This proves that I'm your father." Liam's hand froze over his sketch pad. His face was unreadable, but his small fingers gripped the pencil tighter. Caroline inhaled sharply. "Ethan, I know this is a lot." Ethan continued, keeping his voice gentle. "But I won't walk away. Not again." He turned to Caroline. "I want him to have everything he deserves. A home, stability, a future." Caroline swallowed. "And what does that mean, Ethan? Are you taking him from me?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I don't want to take him away from you." He looked at Liam again. "But I do want to be in his life. If he'll let me." Liam stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached for the paper, his small fingers tracing the printed words. "Does this mean I'm rich now?" Liam asked quietly. Caroline gasped. "Liam!" But Ethan chuckled, the unexpected innocence cutting through the tension. "It means you won't have to sleep on the streets again." Liam considered this. Then, without a word, he picked up his sketch pad and began drawing again. Ethan frowned. "Liam?" The boy hesitated before flipping the sketch pad around. On the page was a drawing of Ethan. Standing beside him was Liam, and between them, holding both of their hands, was Caroline. Ethan's heart clenched. "Can we still be a family?" Liam asked softly. Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't know how to be a father, Liam." Liam smiled a little. "That's okay. I don't know how to be a son either." Caroline covered her mouth, emotion welling in her eyes. Ethan reached out, hesitated, then ruffled Liam's hair. "Then I guess we'll figure it out together." Liam beamed. Ethan exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. For the first time in years, something felt right, but outside these walls, the world was waiting. And not everyone would welcome this news. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The next morning, Ethan strode into Blackwood Enterprises, his face unreadable, his presence commanding. The entire company was buzzing with rumors. Whispers about the billionaire's secret son, the inheritance clause, and the board's plans to push him out. Jonathan Hale was waiting outside the boardroom. "They're inside already," he said in a low voice. "Shaw's rallying the others. He wants you out." Ethan smirked. "Let's see him try." Hale nodded and opened the door. Inside, the board members sat in a semicircle, their faces tense. At the center of it all was Cameron Shaw, his silver hair slicked back, his expression smug. "Ah, Ethan," Shaw drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Glad you could join us. We were just discussing the unfortunate scandal you've dragged this company into." Ethan took his seat at the head of the table, unbothered. "By scandal, do you mean the fact that I have an heir?" Shaw scoffed. "A homeless child you conveniently discovered after your father's will was revealed? You expect us to believe this wasn't orchestrated?" Ethan arched an eyebrow. "Are you accusing me of fabricating my own son?" A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Shaw kept a smirk. "I'm saying this company needs strong, focused leadership. You've been distracted." Ethan leaned forward, his voice quiet but lethal. "And yet, despite my supposed distractions, profits have increased by 20% this quarter. So tell me, Shaw, how exactly am I failing as a leader?" Shaw's jaw tightened. "This isn't just about numbers. This is about stability. Investors don't like uncertainty. And a secret heir? That's a liability." Ethan smirked. "You're right. Investors don't like uncertainty, which is why I've already taken steps to eliminate it." He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. The largest financial news outlet in the country suddenly went live on the boardroom's projector. Breaking news: Ethan Blackwood announces his heir. A press conference filled the screen. There was Ethan, standing tall before a room full of reporters. Next to him was Liam, holding onto his hand. Liam is my son, and from this day forward, he will never be abandoned, never be overlooked. I am proud to be his father, and anyone who questions his place in my life or my leadership can find the door. The boardroom was silent. The Shaw's face turned red with fury. You, Ethan, cut him off. This company was built on power, Shaw, and nothing is more powerful than the truth. So unless you want to be the man who tried to push out the CEO for stepping up as a father, I'd suggest you sit down. Shaw opened his mouth, but one by one, the board members nodded in Ethan's favor. Hale smirked, leaning back. Looks like the motion to remove Ethan has failed. Ethan stood, adjusting his cufflinks. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a son to take to school. And just like that, he walked out, still the king of his empire. Ethan stood outside Liam's new private school, watching as his son hesitated at the entrance. The prestigious academy was nothing like the streets Liam had known. The polished floors, crisp uniforms, and towering brick walls seemed foreign to him. Liam adjusted his blazer uncomfortably. I don't think I fit in here, he murmured. Ethan crouched beside him, straightening his tie. Neither did I when I was your age, he admitted. But you're not just anyone, Liam. You're my son. Liam frowned. So I have to act like a billionaire's son now? Ethan smirked. No, you just have to be yourself. The rest will fall into place. Caroline, standing nearby, smiled softly. He'll be fine, Ethan. He's tougher than he looks. Liam exhaled, nodded, and squared his shoulders. Okay, I'll try. As Ethan watched him walk into the building, he felt something strange, a nervousness he had never experienced before. He could win hostile takeovers, crush corporate enemies, but this? Letting his son walk into a world he didn't know how to navigate. It was terrifying. Caroline nudged him. You're acting like a worried dad. He huffed. Maybe I am. She chuckled. Welcome to parenthood. Ethan stood outside Liam's new private school, watching as his son hesitated at the entrance. The prestigious academy was nothing like the streets Liam had known. The polished floors, crisp uniforms, and towering brick walls seemed foreign to him. Liam adjusted his blazer uncomfortably. I don't think I fit in here, he murmured. Ethan crouched beside him, straightening his tie. Neither did I when I was your age, he admitted. But you're not just anyone, Liam. You're my son. Liam frowned. So I have to act like a billionaire's son now? Ethan smirked. No, you just have to be yourself. The rest will fall into place. Caroline, standing nearby, smiled softly. He'll be fine, Ethan. He's tougher than he looks. Liam exhaled, nodded, and squared his shoulders. Okay, I'll try. As Ethan watched him walk into the building, he felt something strange, a nervousness he had never experienced before. He could win hostile takeovers, crush corporate enemies, but this? Letting his son walk into a world he didn't know how to navigate. It was terrifying. Caroline nudged him. You're acting like a worried dad. He huffed. Maybe I am. She chuckled. Welcome to parenthood. The next morning, the world woke up to a scathing press release from Blackwood Enterprises that Ethan Blackwood responds to attacks against his and stood in front of a podium, his expression hard, his presence commanding. The press room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as they waited for his response to the damning headlines that he took his time before speaking, letting the weight of his silence settle. Then his voice rang clear. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. Liam is my son. Anyone who dares to question that will find themselves on the losing end of a very public and very costly lawsuit. Murmurs spread across the room. Ethan continued, his gaze cutting. As for those who spread lies about Caroline, he leaned in slightly, his tone dropping into something colder, more lethal. I hope you've enjoyed your careers, because after today, they're over. The reporters stiffened. They knew what that meant. Ethan Blackwood didn't make threats. He made promises. Back in his office, Jonathan Hale smirked as he watched the press conference go viral. Ethan had just declared war. You think Shaw got the message? Hale asked, swirling a glass of whiskey. Ethan exhaled sharply, rolling up his sleeves. Not yet, but he will. Minutes later, Cameron Shaw's phone exploded with messages. His assets were frozen. His hidden offshore accounts? Exposed. Every skeleton in his closet. Brought into the light. That'd be why the time Shaw stormed into Ethan's office. His face was red with fury. "You son of a..." Ethan smirked. "Careful, Shaw. You're running out of things to lose." Shaw slammed his fists on the desk. "You ruined me." Ethan leaned forward. "No, Shaw. You ruined yourself the moment you went after my family." Shaw's lips curled in rage, but he knew he was defeated. His empire? Gone. His allies? Turned on him. Hale leaned back, amused. "You should know by now, no one beats Blackwood." Shaw stormed out, his career in ashes. Ethan exhaled, then turned to Hale. "That takes care of one problem." Hale arched an eyebrow. "And the other?" Ethan's gaze softened slightly. "Liam, I have to be more than just a protector. I have to be his father." That evening, Ethan found Liam in his bedroom, sketching on a notebook. He looked up as Ethan sat beside him. "You okay, kid?" Ethan asked. Liam shrugged. "People are saying a lot of things about me and Mom." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, they are." Liam hesitated. "Is it always like this? People trying to take you down?" Ethan sighed. "When you have power, some people want to take it away. But you have something even more powerful." Liam frowned. "What?" Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. "A family. And I'll protect ours. Always." Liam stared at him, then slowly smiled. "Okay." For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood wasn't just fighting to win, that he was fighting for his son. Ethan Blackwood could command boardrooms, take down corporate enemies, and crush billionaires who stood in his way. But sitting in his living room, watching Liam struggle with his math homework, he realized one thing. Fatherhood was the hardest challenge of all. Liam scowled at his notebook, tapping his pencil against the page. "I don't get it. What's the point of finding X anyway?" Ethan smirked. "Good question. But in business, we solve problems like this all the time." Liam arched an eyebrow. "So business is just hard math?" Ethan chuckled. "Something like that. Here, let me show you." He grabbed a separate sheet and started breaking down the problem, using real-life scenarios, stock shares, percentages, even calculating profit. Liam's eyes lit up. "Oh, that makes more sense." Ethan ruffled his hair. "See? You're smarter than you think." Liam grinned. "Maybe, but I'm definitely richer than I thought." Ethan laughed, a real laugh, one he hadn't let himself have in years. Caroline watched from the doorway, smiling softly. Who knew Ethan Blackwood could tutor? Ethan smirked. "Don't be so shocked." Liam beamed. "Yeah, Dad's actually pretty cool." Ethan's heart clenched at the word. Dad. He still wasn't used to it, but he liked the sound of it. The peace didn't last long. The next morning, Hale stormed into Ethan's office. "We got a problem." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Hale tossed a file onto his desk. "Derek Whitmore." Ethan's jaw clenched. He hadn't heard that name in years. Whitmore had once been his rival, a billionaire tycoon who had nearly taken Blackwood Enterprises down years ago. Ethan had buried him financially, or so he thought. That Hale's voice was grim. "He's back, and he's got his sights set on you." Ethan's expression darkened. "What does he want?" Hale hesitated, then sighed. "Not your company, Liam." The air in the room grew ice cold. Ethan stood slowly, his voice lethal. "Explain. Now." Hale set his hands on the desk. "Whitmore's claiming Liam isn't your son. He's spreading rumors that Caroline had a relationship with him, and that Liam is actually his heir." Ethan's blood boiled. And no one was going to take his son. His voice was dangerously low. "Then we destroy Whitmore. Completely." I figured you'd say that." Ethan clenched his fists. Whitmore had just made a deadly mistake, but he had come after the one thing Ethan would die to protect. And now, Ethan was going to make him regret it. Ethan Blackwood didn't waste time. That'd be why the end of the day, Whitmore's stock holdings were in freefall. Every investor, banker, and executive associated with him suddenly found their emails flooded with legal threats, investigations, and breach of contract notices. Hale smirked as he leaned against Ethan's desk. "We got him cornered. The SEC is breathing down his neck." His shareholders are panicking. Ethan's eyes were cold. Not enough. Hale arched an eyebrow. You want to bury him deeper? Ethan's voice was calm, controlled. I want him to suffer. 2 nights later, Whitmore barged into a private club Ethan owned, his face red with fury. You think you can ruin me? He snarled. Ethan leaned back in his seat, whiskey in hand, the picture of absolute control. I don't think, Whitmore. I know. Whitmore slammed his hands on the table. I'll expose you. People will believe me. Liam isn't yours, and deep down, you know it. A muscle in Ethan's jaw twitched. This man was desperate, grasping at lies to save himself. Ethan exhaled slowly. You want proof? Whitmore smirked. That's right. DNA test. Let's settle this. Ethan stood, straightening his suit. I don't need a test to know Liam is mine. He stepped closer, his voice lethal. But you? You won't be around long enough to find out. Whitmore's cocky grin faltered. Ethan leaned in. I own every judge, every lawyer, every journalist in this city. By the time I'm done, you'll be bankrupt, blacklisted, and lucky if you can get a job sweeping floors. Whitmore's face paled. Ethan delivered the final blow. Walk away, or I'll make sure you disappear. Whitmore swallowed hard. He knew Ethan wasn't bluffing. Without another word, he turned and stormed out. Ethan arrived home late that night, finding Liam curled up on the couch, sketchbook in hand. Caroline sat nearby, sipping tea. Liam looked up, yawning. Hey, Dad. Ethan's chest warmed. Dad. It was still new, but it was real that he sat beside Liam, glancing at his drawing. It was a sketch of a lion, standing protectively over a cub. Ethan swallowed hard. That's a strong lion. Liam nodded sleepily. Yeah, he protects his kid no matter what. Ethan's heart clenched as he wrapped an arm around Liam and pulled him close. That's right, and he always will. Caroline met Ethan's gaze, her eyes full of quiet gratitude. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood had something worth more than money to a family, and he would never let anyone take it from him.